Alyssa Monroe was no stranger to the subtle undercurrents of bias that often rippled through the world. As a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist, she had fought her way into spaces where she was often underestimated or overlooked. But this wasn't just another story of quiet resilience. This was about the moment when everything reached a boiling point. It all started on what should have been a routine first-class flight. Alyssa boarded the plane, her head held high, her tailored suit immaculate, and her leather carry-on a testament to her hard-earned success. She was looking forward to a peaceful journey, one where she could catch up on work and enjoy a few hours of tranquility at 30,000 feet. The cabin smelled faintly of fresh linen and citrus, the faint hum of engines creating a soothing background noise. As the flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and warm towels, Alyssa settled into her seat, reaching for the complimentary menu. First-class perks, she thought. It was a small luxury she allowed herself after years of grinding hard to build her empire. She glanced around the cabin, noting the other passengers, business executives engrossed in emails, a couple murmuring quietly, and a middle-aged man already leaning back, his champagne flute raised. When the flight attendant approached Alyssa's row, she smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink?" "Yes, I'll have a glass of champagne, please," Alyssa replied, her tone polite but confident. She wasn't demanding. She didn't have to be. Her presence alone carried authority. The flight attendant hesitated, her expression tightening ever so slightly. Alyssa noticed it immediately, that fleeting look of discomfort. It wasn't new to her, but it still stung every time. The attendant's response came after a beat too long. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're out of champagne right now. Perhaps I can offer you sparkling water instead." Alyssa blinked, momentarily thrown off. She had seen the cart, the rows of glasses, the bottles of champagne neatly lined up, and she knew they weren't out. "Out of champagne," she repeated, her voice steady but firm. "Yes, ma'am," the attendant replied, her tone clipped now. She avoided Alyssa's gaze, busying herself with the tray. Something about the way she said it felt off, and Alyssa's instincts kicked in. She didn't push further at that moment, instead leaning back in her seat and letting the interaction play out. It wasn't the first time she'd been on the receiving end of this kind of treatment, subtle, dismissive, and easy to excuse away. But something about this time felt different, sharper, as if the air in the cabin had shifted. Minutes later, the same attendant moved to the next row. Alyssa watched, her sharp eyes catching every detail. The man seated 2 rows ahead, a middle-aged businessman in a crisp navy suit, asked for champagne. Without hesitation, the flight attendant smiled brightly and poured him a glass, the sparkling liquid bubbling as it hit the flute. Alyssa's jaw tightened. There it was. The lie, the double standard, the unspoken implication that she didn't belong. Her hands gripped the armrests of her seat as she forced herself to take a steadying breath. This wasn't the first time she'd been slighted, but it might very well be the last time she let it slide without doing something about it. Moments later, Alyssa reached for her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, her confidence unshaken as she dialed a number she rarely used, her direct contact at the airline's corporate office. If they wanted to dismiss her quietly, they were about to learn just how loud she could be. Her voice was calm, but carried an edge of authority as she explained the situation to the person on the other end of the line. She didn't embellish, didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. By the time she hung up, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted again. This time, the tension was palpable, as if the other passengers could sense the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Within minutes, the senior operations manager from the airline was at her seat. His expression was tense, his tone apologetic, as he introduced himself. "Miss Monroe, I've been informed of an issue. May I have a moment to speak with you privately?" Alyssa's gaze was steady as she gestured for him to sit. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as the manager leaned in, his words hushed but earnest. The flight attendant who had lied to Alyssa now stood at the edge of the aisle, her face pale, her hands wringing nervously. The passengers craned their necks, some whispering to one another, others watching openly. Alyssa's face remained calm, her composure unshaken. This wasn't a spectacle to her. It was accountability. But what happened next would leave the entire cabin stunned, as the quiet power of Alyssa's actions set off a chain reaction no one could have anticipated. The senior operations manager, Mr. Daniels, was visibly uncomfortable as he sat down next to Alyssa. His tailored suit was sharp, but the beads of sweat gathering at his temple betrayed his unease. Alyssa noticed everything, from the way his hands fidgeted with his pen to the slight quiver in his voice when he began to speak. "Miss Monroe," he said softly, careful not to draw too much attention, though by now, most of the cabin was fully aware that something was happening. "First, let me apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. I assure you, this is not the level of service we aim to provide to our first-class passengers." Alyssa's gaze was unwavering. She leaned slightly forward, her tone calm but cutting. "Mr. Daniels, I'm not inconvenienced. I'm disrespected. And there's a big difference between the two." Her words seemed to land heavily, and Mr. Daniels nodded, though his eyes flicked toward the flight attendant who now hovered anxiously a few feet away. Alyssa noticed the subtle glance and decided to push further. "It's interesting," she continued, her voice low but firm. "Your flight attendant told me there was no champagne. Yet, I saw her serve it to another passenger just minutes later. I assume the policy in first class is equal treatment for all. Or has that changed?" The question hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Mr. Daniels shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, but knowing he couldn't evade it. "Of course, you're absolutely correct, Miss Monroe," he said quickly, his words tumbling out as if he was desperate to defuse the situation. "There's no excuse for what happened, and I assure you, we take these matters very seriously." Alyssa raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by the generic response. "Good," she said simply. "Then I trust you'll handle it appropriately. But I'd like to know exactly how this situation is being addressed. I've spent a significant amount of money with your airline, and I expect more than just a hollow apology." Her words carried weight, and it was clear Mr. Daniels wasn't used to passengers challenging him in this way. Most people would have accepted the apology and moved on, but Alyssa wasn't most people. She had spent her entire life navigating spaces that weren't designed for her, spaces where she had to fight for the respect she deserved. This was just another battle in a long line of many. As Mr. Daniels stumbled through another string of assurances, Alyssa's mind wandered briefly. She thought about her journey to this point, the countless moments where she had been overlooked or dismissed. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, she had learned early on that the world often judged people like her before they even opened their mouths. But her parents had raised her to believe in her worth, to carry herself with pride and dignity no matter what. Those lessons had stayed with her, shaping the woman she had become. Alyssa had worked tirelessly to build her business, a luxury lifestyle brand that catered to high-net-worth clients. She had faced her fair share of challenges, from dismissive investors to skeptical clients, but she had overcome them all with grit and determination. Her success wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement to the world that she belonged in spaces that often tried to shut her out. This moment on the plane felt like a microcosm of that larger battle. It wasn't just about the champagne. It was about the principle. She wasn't going to let someone diminish her. Not here, not anywhere. Back in the present, Alyssa's attention returned to Mr. Daniels, who was now visibly flustered. "Miss Monroe, I'd like to personally ensure that this matter is resolved to your satisfaction," he said, his tone almost pleading. Alyssa nodded, though her expression remained unreadable. "I'm sure you will," she said coolly, "but let me be clear, I won't settle for a band-aid solution. This isn't just about me. It's about the message your airline sends to its passengers. If this is how you treat someone like me in first class, I can only imagine how others are being treated in other sections of the plane." Her words hit their mark, and Mr. Daniels' face flushed. He stammered out another apology, promising to investigate the matter thoroughly. Meanwhile, the flight attendant who had sparked the entire incident stood frozen, her eyes darting nervously between Alyssa and Mr. Daniels. She looked as though she wanted to disappear, but there was no escape from the scrutiny now. As the conversation continued, Alyssa felt the weight of the other passengers' gazes on her. Some were sympathetic, their expressions silently encouraging her to stand her ground. Others seemed uncomfortable, perhaps grappling with their own complicity in similar situations they had witnessed but ignored. The man who had been served champagne earlier shifted uneasily in his seat, his face a mixture of embarrassment and guilt. Alyssa caught his eye for a brief moment, and he quickly looked away, his cheeks reddening. She wasn't angry with him. It wasn't his fault. But his discomfort was a stark reminder of the privilege that allowed some to move through the world without ever having to question how they were treated. As Mr. Daniels finally stood to address the situation more formally, Alyssa leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She had no intention of letting the matter rest until real accountability was achieved. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had made her point, and the ripple effects were already beginning to spread. What she didn't know yet was just how far those ripples would go. The next steps she took would set off a chain of events that no one on that flight could have predicted, and the consequences would reach far beyond the cabin of that plane. As the plane settled into a tense silence, Alyssa noticed the flight attendant stepping into the galley, her posture stiff and her face pale. From the corner of her eye, Alyssa saw Mr. Daniels discreetly motioning her over, no doubt preparing to have a private conversation about what had transpired. Alyssa wasn't privy to their hushed tones, but she didn't need to hear the words to understand what was happening. Damage control. She took a steadying breath and glanced at her phone. It buzzed quietly in her lap with a flood of notifications. Her assistant, Janae, had been updating her since Alyssa's initial message. The email she had sent to the airline's corporate office was already making waves, and several executives had been looped into the thread. Janae, ever efficient, had outlined the incident in detail, attaching Alyssa's video footage as supporting evidence. Alyssa tapped out a quick reply, thanking Janae and instructing her to keep the pressure on. This wasn't just about an apology, it was about accountability, about making sure the airline didn't sweep the issue under the rug with empty promises and corporate jargon. Across the aisle, the elderly woman who had smiled kindly at Alyssa earlier gave her an encouraging nod. Alyssa returned the gesture, grateful for the silent support. But not everyone in the cabin seemed to share that sentiment. A man in a crisp business suit sitting a few rows up turned to whisper something to his seatmate, his expression a mix of annoyance and condescension. Alyssa could guess what he was saying, probably something about her being dramatic or making a scene. That reaction wasn't new to her. She had encountered it countless times before, in boardrooms, networking events, and even casual gatherings. The insinuation that she was overreacting, that she should just let things slide. But Alyssa had learned long ago that silence wasn't an option. Silence only allowed injustice to thrive, unchecked and unchallenged. A few minutes later, Mr. Daniels returned to her side, his face carefully composed but his eyes betraying the stress of the situation. "Miss Monroe," he began, his tone polished but strained, "I've spoken with the crew member involved, and we're taking immediate steps to address this internally. I want to assure you that we value all our passengers equally, and this incident does not reflect our values as an airline." Alyssa tilted her head slightly, her expression skeptical. "And what does that actually mean, Mr. Daniels? Immediate steps and internal measures sound nice, but they're meaningless without specifics." Mr. Daniels hesitated, clearly unprepared for the level of scrutiny. "We'll be conducting a thorough investigation," he said finally, his words deliberate but vague. "The crew member will be subject to our disciplinary process, and additional training will be implemented to prevent incidents like this in the future." It was a carefully rehearsed response, one that Alyssa suspected he had used before in similar situations. But she wasn't satisfied. "An investigation is a start," she said evenly, "but it doesn't undo what happened here. And frankly, training sessions only go so far if the underlying culture isn't addressed." Mr. Daniels nodded, his expression tight. "I completely understand your concerns, Miss Monroe. If there's anything further we can do to make this right, please don't hesitate to let us know." Alyssa considered his words for a moment before responding. "I'd like a written acknowledgement from your corporate office outlining the steps being taken to ensure this doesn't happen again, and I expect it before we land." The request clearly caught Mr. Daniels off guard, but he nodded quickly, likely realizing he had little choice. "Of course," he said, his voice strained but accommodating. "I'll coordinate with our team immediately." As he walked away, Alyssa leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. She wasn't naive. She knew how these situations often played out. A few apologies, a promise of change, and then back to business as usual. But she was determined not to let that happen this time. Meanwhile, in the galley, the flight attendant, Rebecca, according to her name tag, was visibly distressed. She paced back and forth, wringing her hands and muttering under her breath. One of her colleagues tried to console her, but Rebecca shrugged off the gesture, clearly overwhelmed. "I didn't mean for it to blow up like this," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "It was just a split-second decision. I didn't think she'd notice." Her colleague, a younger attendant with a nervous expression, interrupted gently. "You know that's not the point, right? It's not about whether she noticed. It's about what you did. You treated her differently, and now it's coming back to bite all of us." Rebecca didn't respond, her face pale as she stared out at the cabin. The weight of her actions was sinking in, but whether it was regret or fear driving her reaction was unclear. Back in her seat, Alyssa felt the tension in the air as the hours dragged on. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was subdued, the usual hum of quiet conversation replaced by an awkward silence. It was as though everyone was waiting for something to happen, though no one could predict exactly what that might be. Alyssa's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Janae. Corporate just replied, "They're taking this seriously. CEO has been copied in. We'll keep you posted." The update was a small but significant victory. Alyssa allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Though she knew the battle wasn't over, there was still much to be done, and she was ready to see it through. What Alyssa didn't know was that this incident was already making waves far beyond the confines of the plane. By the time they landed, the story would have reached a much wider audience, and the fallout would be more significant than anyone had anticipated. As the plane cruised steadily through the sky, the tension inside the first-class cabin thickened like a storm waiting to erupt. Alyssa could feel it in every glance cast her way, in the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she shifted in her seat. Her phone was a constant stream of updates, each one a reminder that this was bigger than just her. Janae's latest message had confirmed that the airline's CEO himself was now involved, and Alyssa's video had begun to circulate among key stakeholders. It wasn't a matter of if the story would break, it was a matter of when. Still, the minutes dragged on, each one amplifying the discomfort in the air. Rebecca emerged from the galley again, her demeanor visibly changed. Her usual brisk confidence had been replaced with an almost robotic stiffness, her face a mask of controlled panic. She avoided Alyssa's gaze entirely, focusing instead on other passengers, though even they seemed reluctant to engage with her. Alyssa's neighbor leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're handling this with so much grace," the woman said, her tone a mix of admiration and disbelief. "I don't know if I could stay this calm." Alyssa smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's not about staying calm," she replied. "It's about staying focused. If I let anger take over, I lose control of the narrative." The woman nodded thoughtfully, her respect for Alyssa evident. Across the aisle, Mr. Daniels was typing furiously on his tablet, his face set in a grim expression. Alyssa could only imagine the emails he was fielding from his superiors, all demanding immediate explanations and solutions. Suddenly, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing the cabin to jolt sharply. Gasps rippled through the passengers, and a drink spilled onto a businessman's lap a few rows ahead. The momentary chaos was enough to distract everyone from the brewing storm, but only for a moment. As the plane steadied again, so did the simmering tension. Alyssa decided to check her email, and sure enough, there was a new message from the airline's corporate office. It was a formal acknowledgement of her complaint, promising a full and transparent investigation. But it was the last line that caught her attention. "Please be assured that appropriate measures will be taken, effective immediately." She stared at the screen, her mind racing. The wording was vague, but the implication was clear. They were preparing to act swiftly. Alyssa glanced at Rebecca, who was now standing near the galley with her arms crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Did she know what was coming? As if on cue, Mr. Daniels stood up and made his way to Rebecca. Their conversation was quiet but visibly intense, with Rebecca's expression shifting rapidly from confusion to disbelief and then to anger. Her voice, though low, carried just enough for Alyssa to catch fragments. Not fair, overreaction. Didn't mean. Rebecca's protests were met with firm but quiet responses from Mr. Daniels. Whatever he was telling her, it was clear she wasn't taking it well. After a few minutes, she stormed back into the galley, her face flushed and her movements sharp. Alyssa couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy, despite everything. She didn't revel in seeing someone's career unravel, but actions had consequences, and Rebecca's decision to treat her differently had sparked a chain reaction that couldn't be undone. The other passengers were now openly whispering, their curiosity and unease evident. A man sitting 2 rows ahead turned to his companion, his voice low but insistent. "Something's happening. Did you see how she stormed off? This is going to be big." Alyssa remained composed, though her heart was pounding. She had no idea how this would all end, but she knew they were reaching a critical point. She glanced out the window, the vast expanse of clouds stretching endlessly below them. It was strange, she thought, how something so serene could coexist with the turbulence inside the cabin. Just then Mr. Daniels returned to Alyssa's seat, his expression more strained than before. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice careful and measured, "I want to inform you that immediate action has been taken regarding the crew member involved. She will not be continuing with this flight's service." Alyssa blinked, caught off guard by the abruptness of the announcement. "You've already decided?" she asked, her tone neutral but probing. Mr. Daniels hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Given the circumstances and the evidence presented, it was necessary to address the matter swiftly. We'll be making arrangements upon landing to ensure the situation is resolved appropriately." His words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Alyssa nodded slowly, processing the information. She appreciated the swift action, but it still felt surreal. As Mr. Daniels moved to leave, a voice from across the aisle broke the silence. "Excuse me, but don't you think this is all a bit extreme?" The man in the business suit who had been whispering earlier was now speaking openly, his tone laced with skepticism. "People make mistakes. Does it really warrant this kind of reaction?" Alyssa turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "It's not just about a mistake," she said. "It's about accountability. When you're in a position to serve the public, treating people equally isn't optional. It's a basic standard." The man opened his mouth to reply but seemed to think better of it. He turned away with a dismissive shrug, muttering something under his breath. The exchange left a charged energy in the cabin, with passengers now openly watching Alyssa, Rebecca, and Mr. Daniels as if they were players in a live drama. Even the flight attendants seemed uneasy, their usual efficiency tinged with hesitation. The tension reached its peak when Rebecca emerged from the galley one last time, her face set in a mix of defiance and defeat. She avoided eye contact with everyone, her movements stiff as she gathered her belongings. The cabin was silent as she walked toward the back of the plane, her departure marked by a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Alyssa watched her go, her emotions a swirl of relief, exhaustion, and something she couldn't quite name. She had stood her ground, made her voice heard, and seen the system respond, but at what cost? The resolution was still out of reach, and the questions lingering in the air were as heavy as ever. The cabin felt different after Rebecca's departure, as though the air itself had shifted. For a brief moment, Alyssa allowed herself to exhale, thinking the worst of it was over. Passengers returned to their screens or books, murmured conversations dwindled, and the hum of the engines became the dominant sound again. But something gnawed at Alyssa, a feeling that this wasn't the end. Minutes later, her phone buzzed. It was another message from Jenna. "You're trending," it read, followed by a link to a news site. Alyssa clicked on it, her heart racing as she read the headline. First class passenger records alleged discrimination mid-flight. Airline takes immediate action. The article included a screenshot of her video, her face partially visible as she held up her phone to capture the moment. The text described the incident in detail, though some parts were exaggerated, as if the writer had filled in gaps with assumptions. Her stomach sank. The story was out, but not on her terms. The public now had its own version, twisted by speculation and sensationalism. The video, which she had intended to share only with the airline and perhaps her followers, had somehow leaked. Alyssa quickly texted Janae, "How did this get out? I didn't post it." Janae's response came almost instantly. "I don't know, but it's everywhere. Check Twitter." Alyssa opened the app and saw her name trending. Thousands of tweets flooded the feed, some supportive, others skeptical, and a few outright hostile. Strangers debated her character, her intentions, and whether the airline's actions were justified. She saw hashtags like #JusticeForAlyssa and #OverreactionGauge trending side by side. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just a personal battle anymore. It had spiraled into a public spectacle. And then she saw the other messages, ones she hadn't anticipated. A former flight attendant had tweeted, "This isn't the first time this airline's crew has been accused of bias. I worked there for 5 years, and the stories I could tell." That tweet had gone viral, with countless people chiming in with their own experiences. Alyssa's video had inadvertently opened a floodgate, exposing what seemed to be a systemic issue within the airline. While part of her was glad to see the conversation expanding, another part worried about how much bigger this was becoming. Before she could fully process it, Mr. Daniels approached her again, looking visibly stressed. "Miss Monroe, may I have a word?" he asked quietly. Alyssa nodded, and he gestured for her to follow him toward the galley. Once there, away from the prying eyes of other passengers, he sighed deeply. "I just received word from corporate," he began. "They're aware of the media coverage, and it's causing complications." "What kind of complications?" Alyssa asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping in. "They're concerned about the narrative," Mr. Daniels admitted. "The fact that your video is out there, along with claims from former employees, is painting a picture they're not prepared to address right now. They're asking me to." He hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "To see if you'd consider issuing a statement clarifying that this was an isolated incident and not reflective of the airline as a whole." Alyssa stared at him, incredulous. "You want me to downplay what happened?" "No, not downplay," he said quickly. "Just provide context. Reassure the public that this isn't a pattern. It's about damage control." She shook her head, her frustration mounting. "Damage control for who? Because it sounds like you're more worried about the airline's image than addressing the real issue here." Mr. Daniels sighed again, running a hand through his hair. "Miss Monroe, please understand, I don't make these decisions. I'm just the messenger. But I think you should know that if this escalates further, there could be legal implications." "Legal implications for what?" She shot back. "For telling the truth? For recording my experience?" He didn't answer, his silence speaking volumes. Alyssa returned to her seat, her mind racing. It was clear the airline was scrambling to protect itself, but their tactics only fueled her determination to see this through. She checked her phone again, her notifications piling up faster than she could read them. Amid the chaos, one message stood out. It was from an unknown number, but the content was chilling. ***, you need to stop. You're making enemies you don't want. ***. Her breath caught. She read the message twice, her fingers tightening around the phone. Was this a threat? And if so, who had sent it? The airline? A disgruntled employee? Or was it just some anonymous troll trying to rattle her? Alyssa glanced around the cabin, suddenly hyper-aware of every passenger. Were they watching her more closely now? Did someone here know more than they let on? She felt a shiver run down her spine, but forced herself to stay calm. Janae's next message came through. "Are you okay? Saw the tweet about the threat. Do you want me to call someone?" Alyssa hadn't even noticed that she'd screenshotted the message and sent it to her best friend. She typed back quickly, "Not yet. Let me figure out what's happening first." The turbulence wasn't just in the air anymore, it was everywhere, rippling through the story Alyssa had unintentionally unleashed. As she sat back, trying to collect her thoughts, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, This is your captain speaking. We've just been informed of a slight delay at our destination. Air traffic control has requested we hold our approach for a few extra minutes. We appreciate your patience. The announcement was routine, but something about it felt off. Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that this delay wasn't just about air traffic. Something else was brewing, something she wasn't prepared for. As the plane continued its journey, Alyssa's mind raced with questions. Who had leaked the video? What was the airline really hiding? And most importantly, what would happen when they finally landed? As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the final stretch of the journey. Alyssa tightened her seatbelt and stared out the window, watching the city lights below grow larger. Her heart raced, not from the excitement of landing, but from the uncertainty waiting on the ground. The ominous message she received still lingered in her mind, and the tension from the earlier events was far from resolved. The atmosphere on board was strained, though most passengers acted as if nothing had happened. Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The flight attendants avoided eye contact with her, their movements brisk and calculated, as if trying to stay under the radar. Even Mr. Daniels, who had initially seemed eager to manage the situation, now appeared distant, almost resigned. When the plane finally touched down and taxied to the gate, Alyssa's phone buzzed with yet another notification. This time, it was an email from an investigative journalist. The subject line read, **** urgent. Need to speak about your flight incident. ****, the journalist, who was well known for exposing corporate misconduct, had included a brief note. I've uncovered some alarming information about the airline's handling of complaints like yours. Please contact me as soon as you land. Alyssa's fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to respond. Before she could make a decision, the intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we taxi to the gate. On behalf of the crew, we'd like to thank you for flying with us. The captain's voice was calm, but Alyssa detected a slight edge, as if even he was aware of the tension. As the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers stood and began gathering their belongings. Alyssa moved cautiously, her senses heightened. When she stood to retrieve her carry-on, she noticed a man in a dark suit waiting just outside the galley door. His presence was unusual. He didn't look like airline staff or a fellow passenger. Her instincts screamed that something was off. The man stepped forward as Alyssa approached the exit. "Ms. Monroe?" he asked, his tone formal but firm. "I'm with airport security. We need to have a word with you before you leave." Passengers paused, turning their heads to watch. Alyssa felt her face flush, but she forced herself to remain calm. "About what?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. "It's a standard protocol," he replied vaguely. "If you'll come with me, we can discuss this privately." Alyssa hesitated, glancing at her phone. She considered calling Janae or even the journalist, but the man's expectant stare left her with little choice. She nodded and followed him down the jet bridge, aware of every step echoing beneath her feet. He led her to a small room near the terminal gates. Inside, another man and woman were seated, both dressed in business attire. The woman introduced herself as a representative from the airline's legal team, while the man remained silent, observing. "Ms. Monroe," the woman began, her tone smooth but rehearsed. "We're aware of the incident on your flight and the subsequent media coverage. First, let me assure you that the airline takes allegations of discrimination very seriously. However, we've also noticed that some of the information being circulated may not be entirely accurate." Alyssa raised an eyebrow. "Not accurate. I have the video to prove it." The woman smiled tightly. "We're not disputing your experience, but the situation has escalated in ways that could be damaging for all parties involved. We'd like to propose a resolution to avoid further complications." Before Alyssa could respond, the silent man finally spoke. "We're prepared to offer you a substantial settlement," he said, sliding a document across the table. "In exchange, we would ask that you refrain from making further public statements or sharing additional content related to this incident." Alyssa's eyes scanned the document. The amount was significant, but the conditions were clear. Silence in exchange for compensation. Her chest tightened. They weren't interested in addressing the problem. They just wanted to make it disappear. She looked up, her voice steady. This isn't about money for me. This is about accountability. You can't just sweep this under the rug. The man's expression hardened. You might want to reconsider, he said quietly. This could get messy for you too. Legal battles, public scrutiny. Are you prepared for that? Alyssa stood, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. I think we're done here. As she walked out of the room, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail from the journalist. She played it as she made her way through the terminal. Ms. Monroe, I've uncovered internal documents showing a pattern of cover-ups within the airline. This isn't just about your case, it's much bigger. Call me? Her resolve solidified. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was about everyone who had faced similar injustices and been silenced. Before leaving the airport, Alyssa posted a message to her social media accounts. The truth is bigger than me. Stay tuned. But as she stepped into her ride home, a second message arrived, a private one, from an unknown sender. It read, asterisk asterisk, you've made your move. Now it's our turn. Asterisk asterisk. The story wasn't over. It had just begun.